Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I talked about what the Confederate and Union forces looked like that were to face one another on the Atlanta campaign. Now I move into the first major battle of the campaign, the Battle of Resaca. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. By early May 1864, Union Major General William T. Sherman assembled his army groups to confront Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and the Army of Tennessee. Sherman initially wanted to use the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio to hold Johnston in place while the Army of the Tennessee marched on and captured Rome, Georgia. This plan fell apart when not all of James McPherson's Army of the Tennessee could make it on time to launch the campaign. So Sherman altered his plan. He would send McPherson on a not as wide swing to cut the railroad south of Johnston at Resaca, Georgia, and as Johnston pulled back to protect his line, the army group would converge on the Army of Tennessee and destroy it or scatter it to the east. Johnston placed most of his troops under the command of John Bell Hood on the north end of Rocky Face Ridge, north of Dalton, and kept William Hardee's corps at Dalton. Only a small force of about 4,000 men guarded Resaca. On May 9, 1864, while Thomas and Schofield distracted Johnston north of Dalton, McPherson pushed his army through Snake Creek Gap and to within sight of the Western Atlantic Railroad, but McPherson got scared that the force that he was encountering was much larger, and that Johnston had pulled his troops away from Dalton to confront the Union advance. So he pulled back to Snake Creek Gap. McPherson ruined a great opportunity for Sherman to have interjected a large force between the Confederate Army and Atlanta, forcing that army to move or be nearly surrounded. Johnston received word of the large Union force getting close to Resaca, and he dispatched part of Hood's troops to Resaca to block the advance. Hood reported that there were no Union forces within 4 miles of Resaca, which calmed Johnston a little, but he still needed to figure out what Sherman was up to. Sherman decided to move most of his army through Snake Creek Gap and began moving them down the west side of Rocky Face Ridge, leaving only the 4th Corps to fight the rear guard of Johnston's army as it retreated toward Resaca. The Union troops moved through the night toward the gap. Soldiers with torches marked the way in the darkness, and during the day, officers were posted to keep the men following the right roads. Fresh from his stint in Mississippi and Alabama, Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk arrived at Resaca with his lead elements to bolster the Army of Tennessee's numbers. Johnston and the Confederate War Department desired Polk to come to Georgia to help Johnston fight off Sherman. When Polk arrived at Resaca, he took over the defenses of the town. Hood, Polk, and some other generals rode together surveying the land around Resaca. One soldier remembered the scene. The generals, together upon their horses, upon a rising ground, evidently very calmly surveying the scene of the expected conflict. There is evidently a heavy thing on hand, for the troops are pouring in from Dalton. The enemy's force is estimated at 150,000 with a large amount of artillery. After the survey, Hood returned some of his troops back to Dalton. Polk accompanied Hood north, where they met with Johnston. Perhaps stirred by the religious fervor taking place around Dalton, as soldiers were being baptized in a nearby creek, or maybe coming to grips with his own mortality after being wounded twice in 1863, Hood asked Polk, the Episcopal bishop and warrior, to baptize him in an unconventional ceremony. Hood stood with crutches instead of kneeling, and the water used to baptize Hood was held in a tin horse bucket. There stood the battered old hero, barely 30 years old. There the warrior bishop, Polk, and there stood your humble servant, with a flaring yellow candle in one hand and a horse bucket of water in the other. To Polk's question, "Dost thou renounce the devil and all his works, the vain pomp and glory of the world, with all covetous desires of the same, and the carnal desires of the flesh, so that thou wilt not follow, nor be led by them?" Hood replied, "I renounce them all." The next day, Polk returned to his troops at Resaca, as Johnston attempted to discover Sherman's plans. When a party of soldiers probed Sherman's lines, they discovered only a small force remained. Sherman was on the move. Johnston began moving troops to Resaca to block Sherman's flanking attempt, setting the stage for the first major battle of the Atlanta campaign, the Battle of Resaca. Johnston positioned his army in the defenses around the town of Resaca, with his left flank on the Oostenaula River and his right flank on the Conasauga River. The Confederate Army beat Sherman's mammoth force to the town and now waited for the Union soldiers to assault their position. On the morning of May 14th, most but not all of Sherman's force was in position around the city. John Schofield's Army of the Ohio occupied the left flank, with the 14th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland on its right. Sherman wanted the two corps to swing like a door, driving the Confederates toward the town. The divisions of Jacob Cox and Henry Judah from the Army of the Ohio, and Absalom Barrett and Richard Johnston's divisions of the Army of the Cumberland, stepped off for the attack. Because the units were swinging to the rightmost brigades made contact with the Confederate line first. Those brigades were unsupported because of the swing and began to fall back as the rest of the attacking column made its swing to the right. Judah's division overlapped Baird's division, creating confusion in the assault. A member of Baird's division remembered, "The face of the country was very rough, rising and falling in a succession of high hills and deep gorges, covered with an almost impenetrably dense growth of timber, rendering it a very difficult matter for troops to advance in line. On reaching the second line of hills, we passed our skirmish line and were struck by the enemy's formidable line. Our advance was here to some extent checked, some of the men in the line stopping and lying down behind the crest of the hills. But the main portion of the lines rushed down the hill and charged toward the enemy's works, under a most murderous fire of canister and shell from the enemy's batteries, as well as the musketry from their lines. Our lines suddenly found themselves confronted by a deep, narrow stream with quicksand in places and steep, muddy banks. Our troops sprang into the creek and opened fire on the rebel lines. The attack proved too devastating to the Union columns, and they began to fall back. For the uncoordinated assault and for the fact that some of the men hadn't been formed into assault columns, Judah was relieved of command a few days later. As Cox's division hit the Confederate line, all of Rhodes Howard's corps began to show themselves on the Union left, but they weren't able to join the attack. The assault on the angle of the Confederate line was a brutal struggle as the Union troops maneuvered over the difficult terrain only to be hit with incredible amounts of musketry and artillery fire. A Tennessean in the Confederate ranks remembered, "Onward they came. The gallant Kentuckians were standing to their work like men, but were about to be overpowered, when Robert C. Tyler's brigade that was laying over behind the hill was ordered to their support, and when Tyler reached the Kentuckians' line, the second repulse was complete in 10 minutes. The Union line fell apart and withdrew to a safe distance, and when they did, the Union artillery began to blast away at the Confederate entrenchments. At one point, a shell fell into one of the rifle pits, where it lay sizzling and ready to explode. Lieutenant F.M. Clark and A.H. Lankford each grabbed at it, and together threw it out of the works. It exploded before it struck the ground. The 4th Corps formed the extreme left of the Union line, but the divisions of that corps didn't reach all the way to the Conasauga River. Johnston realized the opportunity this afforded. The Union flank was in the air, and if he could turn it, Sherman's grip on Resaca would loosen. 2 divisions from Hood's corps made up the extreme Confederate right flank, one division under Carter Stevenson and the other under Alexander P. Stewart. Elements from the 2 divisions attacked at 5 p.m. Although they began their movement at the same time, the longer distance that Stewart had to cover caused his division to need reforming, so he halted it for that purpose while Stevenson continued on. Despite just 2 brigades from Stevenson's division attacking the Union flank, the Confederates sent the troops under David Stanley back, relentlessly pushing the surprised Federals. For some, it became a foot race to get to safety. The Union brigades gradually fell back, but a lone artillery battery remained, the 5th Indiana Light Battery, commanded by Captain Peter Simonson. It was marvelous to witness the rapidity with which the artillery was fired as the danger of capture became apparent to the cannoneers. Perhaps never were 6 guns made to do more rapid and destructive work. They were filled again and again, almost to the muzzle, and fired so rapidly the rebel prisoners captured soon afterward refused to believe that but a single battery had played upon them. The stubborn stand by the Hoosiers, along with the Federal troops from Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps arriving from their position on the right flank, sent Stevenson's men back to their entrenchments. As night fell on May 14th, neither Johnston nor Sherman could dislodge the other from the position.